Resuming debate, the honourable member for Carleton.
Mr. Speaker, I'm rising today to address the cover-up budget. Of course, the Prime Minister attempted to cover up his SNC-Lavalin corruption by introducing $41 billion of new cash spending to paper over the wrongdoing that his former Attorney General brought to light in her very courageous whistleblowing over the last several months. Now, today I rise to address one specific element of that cover-up, and that is the Prime Minister's repeated false statements to the Canadian people, wherein he suggested that no one had ever, that the Attorney General had never brought any of her concerns to his attention prior to being moved out of the role of Attorney General. His implication was that she was making the allegations against him out of sour grapes, that he really had done nothing wrong in interfering with SNC-Lavalin's criminal prosecution, but that the Attorney General had suddenly concocted a story about him after he moved her out of her dream job, and that therefore she should not be believed. Allow me to quote what the Prime Minister said to the Canadian people at a press conference on February 15th, 2019. And I quote, "If anyone, including the former Attorney General, had issues with anything they might have experienced in this government, or didn't feel that we were living up to the high standards we set for itself, it was her responsibility to come forward. It was their responsibility to come forward. And no one did." Let me repeat the relevant part of that quote. If anyone, including the former Attorney General, had issues with anything they might have experienced, it was her responsibility to come forward. It was their responsibility to come forward, and no one did. End quote. Yet, text messages, journal entries, and audio recordings now prove the former Attorney General did come forward literally dozens of times to the Prime Minister and his inner circle. Let me go through the chronology of her whistleblowing. September 16th, 2018, phone conversation between the Prime Minister's staff members, Mathieu Bouchard, Elder Marquis, and the Attorney General's Chief of Staff, Jessica Prince, from testimony by the former Attorney General. I'm quoting now. "My Chief of Staff had a phone call with Mathieu Bouchard and Elder Marquis from the Prime Minister's office. They said they understand that there are limits on what can be done and that they can't direct, but that they hear that our Deputy of Justice thinks we can get the Public Prosecution Service of Canada to say, quote, we think we should get some outside advice on this," end quote. In response, my Chief of Staff stressed to them prosecutorial independence and potential concerns about the interference in the independence of the prosecutorial functions. In other words, at that moment in early September, the Minister's staff did communicate to the Prime Minister's staff that there was what they were asking for would constitute, and I quote, interference in the independence of the prosecutorial function. That is the first piece of evidence I introduce, disproving the Prime Minister's claim when he said it was her responsibility to come forward, it was their responsibility to come forward, and no one did. The next day, September 17th, 2018, the Attorney General came forward in person to the Prime Minister and to the Clerk of the Privy Council. From her testimony, we have here, and I quote, "This same day, September 17th, I had a one-on-one meeting with the Prime Minister that I requested a couple of weeks earlier. When I walked in, the clerk of the Privy Council was in attendance as well. While the meeting was not about the issue of S&C and deferred prosecution agreements, the Prime Minister raised the issue immediately. She goes on and says, "I've further stated that I was very clear on my role as the Attorney General and that I was not prepared to issue a directive in this case, that it would not be appropriate." At that point, the Prime Minister jumped in, stressing that there was an election in Quebec and that I am an MP in Quebec and the member for Papineau. She went on, "I was taken back. My response, and I vividly remember this as well, was to ask the Prime Minister a direct question while looking him in the eye. I asked, are you politically interfering with my role and my decision as the Attorney General? I would strongly advise against it." Now, I've heard members across the way yell out that that is mere hearsay. In fact, today we learned it is not hearsay. In direct questioning of the Prime Minister, I asked him if this exchange occurred, and he confirmed that it did. In other words, he says now, today, that back on September 17th, the Attorney General did raise concerns about him, quote, politically interfering with her role as Attorney General. And she also, quote, strongly advised against it. He admits now that she said that to him in September. How is it then he stood before 37 million Canadians in February and said no one came forward with any concerns whatsoever? But yet that's what he said. It was her responsibility to come forward. It was their responsibility to come forward, and no one did. Well, she did, and he now admits it. So it is no longer he said, she said. She said it, and he now confirmed it. It is impossible to reconcile the Prime Minister's admission today that the Attorney General spoke to him those words in September with his public statement in February that she had never once raised any problem with him. Here we have it, clear as day, that she did, and he now admits that she did. I go on. Prime Minister, on September 19th, conversations between the former Attorney General and the current Finance Minister. She says in her testimony, still on September 19th, I spoke to the Finance Minister on this matter when we were in the House of Commons and told him that engagements from his office...
I'll just interrupt for a moment. I believe the Honourable Member for Regina Louvain is rising on a point of order or privilege.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and sorry for the interruption. I do just need to add briefly to what I said previously on the point of privilege. In response, the member for Windsor West rose to reassure the House that the NDP caucus did follow the Parliament of Canada Act with respect to adopting or rejecting the model rules, including the one for expulsion from caucus. I just want to clearly put on record that what the Act says is that each party caucus needs to hold 4 secret ballot votes on each of those model rules at its first meeting after the election. The NDP caucus did not hold votes, let alone secret ballot votes, on those model rules at our first meeting after the election or at any of our meetings in 2015. So I think rather than just generally suggesting compliance with the Act, it would be necessary for the member from Windsor West or another member to suggest that they remember actually holding secret ballot votes at the first meeting following the election. And I note, Mr. Speaker, that claim has not been made.
Very good. We'll take that under consideration and add that to the fact. Before we go to the Honourable Member from Carleton, I have some housekeeping to do. Order. It is my duty, pursuant to Standing Order 38, to inform the House that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows. L'honorable député de Saint-Hyacinthe
The honourable member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Pagotte, Child Care,
East, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, et l'honorable
and the honourable member for Sherbrooke, the CRA.
debate, the honourable member for Carleton.
I had just finished telling the House that the Prime Minister admitted today that, in fact, the Attorney General did raise concerns about political interference in the SNC-Lavalin affair to his face in September, and that contradicted his claim in February that she had never once raised any such concern. Now I move on to another instance where she did also ring the alarm bell about the government's political interference in her role as Attorney General in the SNC-Lavalin criminal prosecution. I'm reading now from her testimony. Still, on September 19th, I spoke to the Minister of Finance on this matter when we were in the House, and I told him that engagements from his office to mine on SNC had to stop, that they were inappropriate. Now, the Prime Minister and the government might try to deny that that conversation occurred, but unfortunately for them, the former Attorney General has now released text messages from the Finance Minister's Chief of Staff in which he confirms that the Minister told him about the Attorney General's concerns. He relayed news of that conversation to Jessica Prince, the Chief of Staff to the former Attorney General. In other words, we know for a fact, based on the admission of the Finance Minister's own Chief of Staff, that the former Attorney General did raise concerns about inappropriate engagements from his office to hers on SNC, and that those engagements, quote, had to stop. So that further contradicts the Prime Minister's claim in February when he said, and I quote, "It was her responsibility to come forward. It was their responsibility to come forward, and no one did." Then on October 26, in conversations between Jessica Prince, the Chief of Staff to the Attorney General, and Matthew Bouchard, Senior Advisor to the Prime Minister. I'm going to read from her testimony again. However, on October 26, 2018, when my Chief of Staff spoke to Matthew Bouchard, the Prime Minister's Senior Advisor, and communicated to him that given that SNC had now filed in federal courts to seek review of the DPP's decision, surely we had moved past the idea that the Attorney General would intervene in getting an opinion on the same question. Mathieu replied that he was still interested in an external legal opinion. Could she not get an external legal opinion on whether the DPP had exercised their discretion properly, and then on the application itself, the Attorney General could have intervened and seek to stay the proceedings, given that she was awaiting that a legal opinion. Then she reported, Mr. Speaker, the Attorney General reported, my Chief of Staff said this would obviously be perceived as interference, and her boss questioning the DPP's decision. So, once again, we have another incident where the Chief of Staff to the Attorney General told senior staff in the Prime Minister's office that what they were asking for would constitute, or at least be perceived as interference. And so that further contradicts the Prime Minister's claim that, and I quote, it was her responsibility to come forward, it was their responsibility to come forward, and no one did, end quote. And then, of course, we have November 22nd, in a meeting between the Attorney General, the senior and two senior staff members in the Prime Minister's office. In mid-November, the PMO requested that I meet with Matthew Bouchard and Elder Marquise to discuss the matter, which I did on November 22nd. This meeting was quite long, I would say about an hour and a half. I was irritated by having to have this meeting, as I already told the Prime Minister, etc., that the deferred prosecution agreement on SNC was not going to happen. That I was not going to issue a directive. Mathieu, in this meeting, did most of the talking. He was trying to tell me that there were options and I still needed to find a solution. I took them through the Director of Public Prosecutions Act, Section 15 and Section 10, and talked about the prosecutorial independence as a constitutional principle, and they were interfering. I talked about the Section 13 note, which they said they had never received, but I reminded them that we had sent it to them in September, months earlier. She went on. Mathieu and Elder continued to plead their case, talking about if I'm not sure, as if I'm not sure in my decision, that we could hire an eminent person to advise me. They were kicking the tires. She goes on. I said no. My mind had been made up, and they needed to stop. This was enough. Yet again, she warned the Prime Minister's staff that their involvement in the criminal prosecution of SNC-Lavalin needed to stop, that this was enough. This is another piece of evidence, I believe backed up by journal entries and perhaps even text messages that followed, which demonstrate that the Attorney General did warn the Prime Minister and his team that they were acting inappropriately, in contradiction to the Prime Minister's public statement later on, and I'm quoting, it was her responsibility to come forward, it was their responsibility to come forward, and no one did. Of course she did, Mr. Speaker. And then on December 15th, she came forward, on December 5th, excuse me, on December 5th, the Attorney General came forward yet again, and she, in a meeting between herself and Gerald Butts, the Prime Minister's most senior advisor. From her testimony, on December 5th, 2018, I met with Jerry Butts. We had both sought out this meeting. I wanted to speak about a number of things, including bringing up SNC and the barrage of people hounding me and my staff. Towards the end of the meeting, which was in the Chateau Laurier, I raised how I needed everybody to stop talking to me about SNC, as I had made up my mind and the engagements were inappropriate, end quote. Again, we have the former Attorney General specifically and clearly complaining about inappropriate engagements, and that everybody, meaning the Prime Minister's team, needed to stop talking to me about SNC. And yet, knowing this, the Prime Minister went in front of 37 million Canadians at a press conference and claimed that the Attorney General had never come forward with any of her complaints about his and his team's conduct in the SNC-Lavalin corruption prosecution. And then again, on December 18th, in a meeting between the Attorney General's Chief of Staff and the Prime Minister's two top assistants, Jerry Butts and Katie Telford, I'm quoting again, she says, on December 18th, 2018, my Chief of Staff was urgently summoned to a meeting with Jerry Butts and Katie Telford to discuss SNC. She recounts the text messages that she received from her Chief of Staff about that meeting, text messages, I might add, she has now released to the public and to the Parliament. Quote, basically they want a solution, nothing new. They want external counsel retained to give you an opinion on whether you can review the DPP's decision here and whether you should in this case. I told them that would be interference. Jerry said, Jess, there is no solution here that does not involve some interference. Yeah. Once again, a senior staff member said in the Attorney General's office, said to the top staff in the Prime Minister's office that what they were doing would constitute, and I quote, interference. And yet the Prime Minister, as I know I'm repeating myself on this particular quote, yet the Prime Minister, despite this fact, went on national television and looked 37 million Canadians in the eye and claimed that if the Attorney General had had any complaints or concerns about his involvement in the SNC-Lavalin prosecution, it was her responsibility to come forward. It was their responsibility to come forward, and no one did. And then on to December 19th, she did come forward again. She did this in her telephone call with Michael Wernick, the Prime Minister's top public servant. And I'm just going to read a few excerpts. She said of the Prime Minister's conduct and the conduct of people around him, "It is entirely inappropriate. It is political interference. So we are treading on dangerous ground here, and I'm going to issue my stern warning, because I cannot, in a manner, and in the prosecution cannot, in a manner that is not objective, that isn't independent. I cannot act in a partisan way. I cannot be politically motivated." All of this screams of that, she says to him. This is going to look like, she goes on, this is going to look like nothing but political interference by the Prime Minister, by you, by everybody else that has been involved in this, politically pressuring me to do this, she says. Does the Prime Minister understand the gravity of what this potentially could mean? This is not about saving jobs. This is about interfering with one of our fundamental institutions. This is about breaching the constitutional principle of prosecutorial independence. You know what? I hope that you, she says, of having to report back to the Prime Minister. You know what? I hope you do, because I do not think anybody respects this. This conversation, she's going on, this conversation that Jerry and Katie had with my Chief of Staff, and I have it, like she wrote down what was said, saying that they do not want to hear any more about legalities, but want to talk about jobs, is entirely inappropriate. In fact, the former Attorney General, in that now infamous telephone conversation that has been recorded and made available for all ears to hear, said the term interference no less than 9 times. In fact, the clerk of the Privy Council responded by saying, all right, well, I'm going to have to report back before the Prime Minister leaves. In other words, the clerk of the Privy Council said that he was going to report back to the Prime Minister on the contents of his conversation with the Attorney General, a conversation that the Prime Minister has used weasel words to avoid admitting he ever knew about. It's funny. After this audio recording came out, the Prime Minister swiftly said that he had not been briefed on the full contents of the conversation until the recording came out. Well, nobody's asking if he was briefed on the full contents of the conversation. People are never briefed on the full contents of any conversation. The question was, did he know about the call before, during, or after it? And today, the Leader of the Opposition asked the Prime Minister precisely that question over and over and over again, and not once did the Prime Minister answer it. This is important because it once again speaks to the credibility of the Prime Minister's claim in February at that famous press conference where he denied that the Attorney General had ever raised any concerns about his political interference in the SNC-Lavalin criminal prosecution. So we now know that the Attorney General again and again and again raised these concerns. She did so in text, and we know she did so because of text messages, journal entries, and audio recordings prove it. They include documents, recordings, text messages that came from September 16th, September 17th, September 19th, October 26th, November 22nd, December 5th, December 18th, December 19th. The Prime Minister really have us believe that he didn't know about any of the warnings that she and her staff made to his staff, to his top personnel, and ultimately to him on these more than half dozen occasions. Mr. Speaker, it is entirely unbelievable that he didn't know that she had spoken out when he went before the Canadian people and claimed that she had not spoken out. Let me just reiterate what I've gone through here. The number of times that the Attorney General did come forward. I'll tell you why I'm going to give you this list. Because the Prime Minister said, I'm going to read the quote again, said that if anyone thought he'd done something wrong on SNC, it was their, quote, it was their responsibility to come forward, and no one did. Well, she did on all of these occasions. September 16th, 2018, a phone conversation with the PMO staff in which she said that she raised the problem. September 17th, 2018, in a meeting with the Prime Minister and the clerk himself. September 19th, a phone conversation between the PMO staff, top staff, and the Attorney General's top staff. September 19th, again, conversations between the Attorney General and the Finance Minister. October 26th, conversations between the Chief of Staff to the Attorney General, Jessica Prince, and the Senior Advisor to the Prime Minister. November 22nd, a meeting between the Attorney General and two top advisors to the Prime Minister. December 5th, in meetings between the Attorney General and Gerald Butts at the Chateau Laurier. December 18th, in meetings between Jessica Prince, Gerald Butts, and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. And of course, December 19th, in that famous and recorded phone call. In all of those cases, she came forward and spoke up about the Prime Minister's personal political interference in the SNC-Lavalin corruption trial. And yet, despite all of those times when she sounded the alarm bell, the Prime Minister stood before all Canadians and said she had never once raised a concern about this matter while she was Attorney General. It was a patent falsehood. He looked Canadians straight in the eye and told them something he knew, or ought to have known, was completely false. He did so in an attempt to discredit his former Attorney General, because she, of course, had demonstrated that he had personally and politically interfered in a manner inappropriate with the criminal prosecution of a Liberal Link corporation accused of fraud and bribery. Now, this raises a number of important questions, Mr. Speaker. One, can we trust anything the Prime Minister says when he stands before Canadians and says anything at all? The answer, of course, comes from the fact that he contradicts his own words on matters of national importance. These are not minor mistakes. He made the false statements that I have just discredited at a press conference on a massive national controversy where he knew everybody would be watching him. You have to wonder the degree of mendacity that must consume this man, that he would be capable of doing that, knowing, and the degree of incompetence that must reside in him, given that the former Attorney General made clear that she had documentary evidence backing up her claims. I mean, the Prime Minister ought to have known at the time he stood forward and made that comment to Canadians that the Attorney General would want to step forward and validate her claims using the text messages and other personal notes that she had kept throughout the 4-month campaign when he and his team were pressuring her. So I've just spent 25 minutes thoroughly disproving the Prime Minister's February 15th press conference statement and showing that he made statements that he knew were false in respect of the Attorney General's earlier complaints about his role in the SNC affair. Let me move on to
another falsehood that has now been exposed. The Prime Minister, in February, when the Prime Minister was first accused of politically pressuring his former Attorney General, in a Globe and Mail article by Bob Fife and Steve Chase, immediately came out and said the story was false. There's nothing to it. It's just false. Nothing more to it. It's false. Well, we now know through 41 pages of evidence, some of which I have now relayed in the House of Commons, that his denial was false, that in fact the pressure existed and it was real. Now members of the front bench of the Liberal government no longer even deny that the Attorney General was pressured. They now have moved the goalposts and just claim that the pressure was not illegal. But that in itself is a very big change in their position. The PMO issued statements in the 48 hours following the Fife Chase story in which they just flatly denied pressuring the Attorney General, denied it altogether. Now, they tacitly admit that they did so, and they don't even contest the Attorney General's validated claims that they contacted her at least 20 times, directly or through her staff, in order to get her to change her position on the prosecution of SNC-Lavalin in its fraud and bribery case. So that is a second contradiction. Let me move now to a third contradiction. In that famous September 17th meeting the Prime Minister had with the Attorney General, he twice told her that she had to immediately act to signal a willingness to negotiate a deferred prosecution agreement with SNC-Lavalin, or the company would announce within weeks that its headquarters would leave Montreal. He and the clerk of the Privy Council, along with others in the top levels of the Prime Minister's inner circle, made it clear that she had mere days to do this, or the headquarter move would be announced. They even said that it would be announced before the Quebec election. That election was only days away. Now, we know, first, a number of things about that claim. One, the headquarters, the company has not since announced it will move its headquarters, absent a deferred prosecution agreement. In fact, the headquarters remains in Montreal, and no public announcement to the contrary has been made. Two, the company cannot move its headquarters out of Montreal because it has a $1.5 billion loan agreement with the Quebec Pension Plan requiring that it remain in that city until the year 2024. Three, they just signed a 20-year lease on their building in Montreal and announced a multi-million-dollar renovation to the headquarters to accommodate their thousands of Montreal area employees. You don't do purpose renovations for your own employees and then get up and move. It's a waste of money. Four, moving the SNC headquarters out of Montreal would not in any way limit the company's criminal liability in the charges of fraud and bribery. Those charges would go ahead no matter whether the headquarters of SNC-Lavalin were located in London, Washington, Sydney, Australia, or Kalamazoo. At the end of the day, the trial would happen no less. It is not like an individual bank-robbing fugitive who could skip the country and vanish into the Bermuda Triangle, never to be prosecuted. The company is facing prosecution no matter where its headquarters is. Therefore, the Prime Minister's claim that it would move was never sensible at all. 5, the CEO of SNC-Lavalin has said in an interview on the Business News Network that he never threatened that the headquarters of the company would leave if the prosecution proceeded. Finally, we know that any damage to the company's reputation as a result of a conviction would be similarly severe if the company signed on to a deferred prosecution agreement, because signing said agreement would require SNC admit to egregious criminal acts of fraud and bribery. Doing so through a criminal conviction or doing so through an admission in such an agreement would have an equally large impact on the company's reputation, and therefore signing an agreement would not in any way, shape, or form protect the company's interests, protect the company's headquarters in Montreal, as the Prime Minister falsely claimed. Now, it's interesting that when I asked the Prime Minister in the House of Commons whether or not he had told the Attorney General that the headquarters would move, he denied having said so. The problem with that denial, and here we have yet another falsehood, is that he had repeated the false claim that SNC would move out of Montreal and Canada altogether at his famous February 15th press conference. In other words, he's making this false claim not just to her face, but to all Canadians, and therefore cannot deny having made it at all. So that is yet another false statement that the Prime Minister and his office have made in this entire affair. I just list 3 falsehoods that he has uttered in respect of his involvement in trying to halt the charges against SNC-Lavalin for fraud and corruption. And that doesn't even take into consideration the falsehoods that his staff members have stated. Gerald Butts came before the Justice Committee and said, if we were doing anything wrong, why weren't we having this conversation in September, in October, in November, in December? But, Mr. Speaker, all of the documentary evidence show they were having exactly that conversation in September, in October, in November, and in December. Text messages show that they were having that conversation in September, in October, in November, in December. By his own admission, he had that conversation with the Attorney General herself at the Chateau Laurier Lounge in December. The Prime Minister has admitted that he attended meetings with the Attorney General where she raised her objections in September. We have text messages showing that the conversation was happening in the 2 middle months of October and November. So in other words, Gerald Butts' statement that they weren't having that conversation in those 4 months was just patently false, and proven false now by evidence, not hearsay, but evidence, text messages, journal entries, and of course, we now have heard the audio of the conversation itself in December with the clerk of the Privy Council. So, the fact that Gerald Butts felt no compunction about going before a parliamentary committee and stating such a patent falsehood just speaks to how liberally this government and its most senior members are prepared to dispense with the truth in order to defend themselves in this corruption scandal. You ask yourself, Mr. Speaker, if a Prime Minister and members of his inner sanctum are prepared to contradict themselves and state easily disprovable falsehoods over and over and over again, is that really the behavior of someone who has nothing to hide? If it is, if they do have nothing to hide, then why won't they let us conduct a full investigation?
Exactly.
Why don't we take all of the names of the people who appear in those text messages that now are in possession of the House of Commons and bring them before a parliamentary committee to question them on their alleged interference in the SNC-Lavalin corruption trial? If the Prime Minister is so confident that he and his team did nothing wrong or illegal, why wouldn't he let the sunshine in? After all, during the campaign, he said sunshine was the best disinfectant. Or as he called it in plagiarizing Laurier, sunny ways, my friends, sunny ways. Well, let's open up the curtains in the Ethics Committee and let the sunshine, the warm glow, pour in. And let's see what we find when all the dark corners are lit up. But so far, the Prime Minister has refused to allow the sunshine in. He has shut down the Justice Committee. He shut down the Ethics Committee. So we have a Justice Committee with no justice and an Ethics Committee with no ethics. Now, that being said, I do have some hope that this investigation may well resume. And I base that on the comments of two Liberal MPs who are members of the Ethics Committee. Two of them have stated that the reason why they were initially against having an Ethics Committee investigation in the SNC-Lavalin affair was because it would be premature. We needed to see all the documentary evidence. At that time, it had not been tabled with the House of Commons. Well, now it has. The documents came to all of us on Friday evening. We have now had opportunities to read through all of the plethora of text messages, journal entries, written accounts, and of course we've all listened to that famous audio tape. Now that we have seen all the evidence that is available so far, those two Liberal MPs who claimed that the investigation was premature can put their minds at ease and allow that investigation to go ahead. Now, what more could we find if we did such an investigation? One, we could find out why the Prime Minister stated falsely that the Attorney General had never raised any concerns about his interference in the SNC-Lavalin affair. Two, we could find out if someone lied to the Attorney General in order to try and get her to shelve a criminal prosecution, itself potentially a crime under Section 139 of the Criminal Code. Three, we could find out if the shuffle of the former Attorney General out of her position was specifically designed to allow for SNC-Lavalin to get a deferred prosecution agreement. And let me pause on that point for just a moment. Let's examine the state of play in SNC-Lavalin's quest to have its corruption charges shelved. Under the former Attorney General, its quest had failed. She had considered whether or not it would be appropriate to overturn the top prosecutor and instruct that a deal with SNC-Lavalin go ahead to shelve the trial, and she had decided it was not appropriate. Her mind was made up, something we see in the conversations that were recorded, the text messages that were sent, and the other written evidence that has since been provided. In other words, SNC-Lavalin, under the former Attorney General, your request to have the charges shelved was denied. Under the current Attorney General, the person by whom the outgoing Justice Minister was replaced, he has now said he is open to the idea of granting a deferred prosecution agreement. So, the cabinet shuffle caused a material change in the state of play. We've gone from, with respect to the SNC's desire to have a deal shelving charges, we've gone to no under the former Attorney General to maybe under the current Attorney General. Now, whether the Prime Minister wants to deny or not that that was his intention, it is the result of the shuffle. There is absolutely no doubt the status of a possible deferred prosecution agreement for SNC-Lavalin has changed as a result of the cabinet shuffle. The door was slammed shut under the former Attorney General. The door is now open under the current Attorney General.
Shame.
We need to know if the current Attorney General received any instructions on this matter before he got the appointment. Did the Prime Minister, or more likely, a member of his staff or inner circle, communicate to the incoming Attorney General or those around him that his role as the top law officer of the Crown would involve extending a settlement to SNC-Lavalin? If the answer is yes, then we would know that the purpose of the shuffle was precisely to get a special deal for this powerful, Liberal-linked corporation. And that was the theory that the outgoing Attorney General had in her mind. She said, she has since written in her letter to the Justice Committee, that she was planning to resign as Veterans Affairs Minister if the incoming Attorney General decided to impose a settlement to shelve the charges on SNC-Lavalin. She believed, as she said numerous times to the Prime Minister's inner circle at the time of the shuffle, that she knew why she was being moved. And the reason? Because the Prime Minister, she believed, was determined to see this Liberal-linked company get out of trial, and she was not prepared to do it. If she's right, then the corollary of that fact is likely that the incoming Attorney General was willing to grant a settlement to the company. Canadians need to know that. Because here's the real and serious risk to the rule of law going forward. Forget about the abuses that might have happened in the past. It is highly possible maybe even probable, that the Prime Minister plans to use his new and more malleable Attorney General to issue a settlement shelving the SNC-Lavalin fraud and bribery charges right after the next election. And if that is his plan, if he plans once again to interfere politically, have his Attorney General issue a written directive to the top prosecutor instructing her to shelve the charges and sign a deal with this company, then Canadians should know about it before they go to the polls. I'm prepared to make an announcement, if I can be so bold, about the approach that Conservatives would take in this matter. I can state confidently that if the current Conservative leader is made Prime Minister in October, he will not direct his Attorney General, whomever he or she may be, to interfere and shelve the criminal charges that SNC-Lavalin faces. Canadians can know that. He has stated very clearly that he will not politically and personally interfere to extend a deal to SNC-Lavalin. They don't know that about the current Prime Minister. He and his current Attorney General are leaving open the possibility, amazingly so, that they may still politically interfere in this trial. That is the astonishing thing. Let's just behold that for a moment. After the 2 months that he's had, you'd think the approach he would take to putting this to rest would be to say definitively to Canadians, I'm out of this. I'm not going to get involved ever again in a criminal prosecution. But to the contrary, he's saying exactly the opposite. He's saying that his current Attorney General may still interfere in the trial, that he may write a letter to the top prosecutor requiring that the prosecutor extend a settlement to the company. That would be a gross miscarriage of justice. Think about that. If you have a homeless person charged with stealing a loaf of bread, they don't have the ability to knock on the door of the Prime Minister's office and say, hey, can you make the judge go light on me? Maybe could you ask the Crown prosecutor to drop the charges and sign a deal where I just apologize and give back the stolen bread? So if it doesn't work that way for a homeless man, why should it work that way for a powerful multi-billion-dollar Liberal-linked corporation? If we live in a country where corporations have the ability to buy justice with wads of cash paid to lobbyists, those lobbyists can swarm all over Parliament Hill like flies on honey and influence the Prime Minister to step in and let the corporation off. If that is really the way the Prime Minister wants to administer the justice system in this country, we should know about it before the election so that Canadians can consider it in their vote. In other words, this is not just about holding the government accountable for what they've already done. It's about giving Canadians all of the information about what they might yet do. If the Prime Minister thinks he can defend the possibility of having his Attorney General get this company off trial, then he should go on the campaign trail and say so.
He should go from one end of the country to the other and tell people that. He should go to Montreal, and he should talk to the people who've been robbed by this company and its executives in the bribery affair at the Jacques Cartier Bridge, or the McGill Health Centre, another instance of bribery. But more than that, next time he's in Africa, he should go to Libya and go into the streets of the ghettos where people live in squalor. And he should tell the people there that he has no problem granting special deals to the company that is alleged to have stolen $130 million of their money. Wow. Because that is the allegation before us here. Some have tried to trivialize it and say that all it is the Gaddafi's getting yachts and prostitutes from this Canadian corporation. They say it is just a victimless crime. And therefore, it's better to settle the matter and avoid a messy trial. That is the argument we hear from proponents of a so-called deferred prosecution agreement for SNC-Lavalin. But it is not a victimless crime. It was wretched, parasitical corruption that robbed the people of Libya of $130 million. These are among the poorest people in the world. They don't have $130 million to spare. But that kind of wretched corruption is not deserving of prosecution in a criminal court, then I don't know what is. Furthermore, this is not a case of where a few bad apples made a small mistake and then the company found out and reported that mistake. Rather, the company had to get caught. It was only when Swiss authorities found out about some of the corruption and prosecuted one of SNC's perpetrators that the RCMP got wind of the matter and began its own investigation that resulted in the charges roughly 4 years ago. So it wasn't that the company was so honest and so pure in trying to expel from its midst these bad apples and that they came forward and fessed up and tried to make it right. No. They had to be caught. Just like they had to be caught in the bribery case at the Jacques Cartier Bridge, the bribery case at Montreal, criminal allegations that have surfaced with respect to the company in Mexico, in Panama, in Switzerland, in Libya, and God knows where else. This is a company with a track record of systematic corruption at the highest levels. The former CEO has pled guilty to bribery. So we're not just talking about a few small bad apples who play junior roles in faraway lands. It is a problem of systematic corruption, top to bottom, through and through. And it is going to be on the ballot in the next election. Canadians will have to decide whether or not they think it's appropriate for a prime minister to personally and politically interfere to shelve criminal charges of fraud and bribery into a powerful party-linked company like this one. And that is one of the reasons why we need the Ethics Committee to get all of the facts. Now, before Canadians vote. Because the Prime Minister's intention is to let the company off after the election, when he no longer needs voters, he should say so now. He should look people in the eye and say that he believes that the Attorney General in his cabinet would be completely justified in writing down a directive to the prosecutor to say, settle this matter, make it go away, sweep it under the rug, let them pay a fine, say sorry, and move on. Because I can tell you that will not be the position of the Conservative Party. The Conservative position will be very simple and very clear. The prosecutor and the prosecutor alone should decide how to proceed with these criminal charges. And so far, this prosecutor, the DPP, has shown she understands the law and she has acted in a manner that is correct in this case. We expect that she should be allowed to continue to do so. And a Conservative government will make sure that she or anybody who replaces her with time have that independent role. That is exactly what the Director of Public Prosecutions Act foresaw when it became law in 2006 with the passage of the Federal Accountability Act. It foresaw an independent prosecutor, completely free of politics, someone who had so much leeway that she could not even be fired by the Prime Minister or any member of the government unless all of the House of Commons voted to validate such a firing. The purpose of that was to keep the prosecutorial function of our legal system out of the reach of politicians. Yet the Prime Minister extended his reach as far as he could to try and interfere with that in this case. What is perhaps even more insulting is that he thought he could distract Canadians from the resulting scandal by spraying $41 billion of cash at them in his recent cover-up budget. He thought Canadians would just completely forget that his Attorney General had accused him of interfering in a criminal prosecution if he pulled out a fire hose filled with dollar signs and just sprayed it all over the country. Mm-hmm. But frankly, what's happened is not that the budget has distracted from his scandal is distracted from his budget. It doesn't seem to matter how much money he sprays around. Canadians are determined to protect the independence of our prosecution and our rule of law in this country. But here's the bad consequence that comes out of that kind of pre-election political spending. It comes with a cost. I call it the Liberal three-step. Massive scandal before the election, massive deficit spending to distract from it, and then, of course, massive tax increases to pay for it all after the election is over. Right? Because money isn't free. The government doesn't actually have any money. All that it spends comes from the people who earned it in the first place. It cannot give people anything without first taking it away. And boy, does this Prime Minister ever like to take it away. Mm-hmm. He's already raised taxes on the average Canadian family by $800. Took away tax credits for kids' sports, children's arts, students' textbooks, and some of their tuition fees. He took away the transit tax credit from passengers on buses. He took away numerous other tax breaks like income splitting, which helped bring fairness to families where one spouse earns more than another. He brought in new tax penalties for small business, including those who share the work and earnings with family members or who save within their company for retirement, maternity leave, or a rainy day. He's increased payroll taxes, CPP payroll taxes on both small businesses and workers. And that doesn't even include the carbon tax, which kicked in on Monday, punishing commuters and seniors on fixed incomes who are trying to heat their homes. Though that is his record of tax increases so far. But the worst is yet to come. We know that because he's tried to raise taxes even more. He attempted to tax health and dental benefits provided by companies to their employees. He backed off after those companies and those employees rose up against him.
He tried to impose a 73% tax on the passive income of small businesses. He tried to double the tax paid by farmers and small business owners when they pass their companies down to the next generation within their families. He tried even to take away the disability tax credit from diabetics. Finally, the tax increase that was perhaps most disgusting, from which he was forced to back down, was when he tried to tax something called employee discounts. So you know when that waitress gets a free chicken salad sandwich at 2 in the morning when she's on her 15-minute break? He wanted the small business owner, the restaurant owner, to actually have to add the value of that sandwich to the waitress's T4 slip so that she could pay taxes on that at the end of the year too. It's just petty. His desire to extract more and more money from the pockets of the people who earned it so he can spend it for them is insatiable. And it's just getting started. We know he put all those tax increases on hold, but they will all be back after the next election when he no longer needs voters, but still needs their money. And then there's the truth about the carbon tax. Prime Minister claims that an Ontario family will only pay about $600 in higher gas, heat, grocery, and other inflation costs. However, we are asked to take his word for it, because I filed access to information requests to get all the supporting documents that led up to that calculation, and guess what I got? A big pile of documents with black ink all over the numbers. In other words, they gave me the costing, they just didn't let me see the numbers. Why? If the tax costs what the government claims, wouldn't they want to produce all the numbers so that Canadians could confirm that fact? But they didn't, because of course this tax will cost much more than the government admits. The cost, of course, is hard to calculate. Unlike income taxes, which you can calculate at the end of the year when you do your filing, or by simply looking at the payroll deductions, or sales taxes, which you can add up by simply looking at the receipts of the things you buy, carbon taxes are insidious. They are embedded in every single good and service that you buy. Sometimes they are embedded, compounded in multiple times into the same product. You buy a piece of farm equipment, for example. Well, you pay for the transportation of that farm equipment to the local John Deere outlet, but you also pay for all the energy tax on the energy that was used in the manufacturing outlet that assembled it. And of course, there's lots of steel in John Deere tractors, and so you're paying for the carbon tax that was embedded in the cost of shaping and molding that steel at the steel mill.
And the GST.
Oh, and by the way, did I mention that they're charging HST on the carbon tax? Yeah, exactly. A tax
on a tax.
On the tax. And his estimate of the cost of the carbon tax, the Prime Minister's, does not include the compounding effect of the HST on the carbon tax.
Ridiculous.
Finally, even if, despite everything I've just told you, you still believe that the Prime Minister's carbon tax will only cost what he says, that doesn't account for his plans to increase the rate after the next election. According to government documents from both Environment and Finance, after the year 2022, that's just 3 years from now, the tax will have to increase in, quote, severity. Increase in severity. That means the rate will actually go up. But by how much? Well, according to an Environment Canada document, it would have to go up to between $100 and $300 a ton of carbon. Right now, the rate is only $20. So if it did go up to $300, it would be 15 times higher than it is right now. Based on the government's own numbers, that would equal $5,000 for a family of 2.5 people in Saskatchewan, or $3,000 for a similar family in Ontario. Now, if you have a big family fortune, an extra $5,000 in higher gas, heat, grocery costs is not such a big deal. But unlike the Prime Minister, most Canadians don't inherit tax-preferred trust funds like him. And therefore, they can't absorb the cost of a $5,000 or $3,000
carbon tax, as may be the case if he's reelected. He has no empathy whatsoever for people who are struggling with the cost of living. He, in fact, was in Vancouver, and they asked him about the $1.60 a litre gas people were paying not long ago in that city, and he said, that is exactly what we want. Wants high gas prices because he thinks it'll make people behave better. I'm not exactly sure what behavior he's referring to. He believes that they should stop driving to work, stop heating their home. Are those bad behaviors according to this Prime Minister? Well, we know that he has no concern whatsoever about increasing the cost of living by imposing higher taxes. He's done it already, and all the evidence from the carbon tax cover-up to his attempted tax increases elsewhere suggest that he will do much, much more after the election, when he no longer needs voters but still needs their money. That was the Kathleen Wynne Dalton McGuinty technique for 14 years. And who was the architect of that agenda? Gerald Butts, the outgoing PMO puppet master who recently resigned in disgrace because of the SNC-Lavalin scandal. We know that he is still the Prime Minister's intellectual architect, the man who is calling all the shots and will be running the Liberal campaign. His modus operandi is to rack up massive spending and pay for it by piling taxes on the working class. That's why Ontario had the highest poverty rates and the lowest middle class income growth of any province in Canada during the McGuinty-Wynne reign. We don't need to see that disaster exacted on Canadians. The next reason we know that this Prime Minister will raise taxes is because he's running out of money. His deficits are growing. They are $20 billion this year, and that is in the year in which he promised a balanced budget. Remember his famous words, the budget will balance itself. Well, that sure hasn't happened on the appointed time schedule that he claimed it would during the last election, has it? No. That debt will always metastasize into higher taxes because somebody's got to pay those rich bondholders. They don't lend us money out of the goodness of their heart. They expect to get more back from Canadians than they lend, and they will if this Prime Minister keeps adding debt at unsustainable rates. That's the record so far. Now, there's good news and bad news. Good news is we're not broke yet. The bad news is we will be if this Prime Minister is reelected. The family's running out of money, but they're not yet broke. They sit down at the kitchen table to discuss what to do about the situation. The responsible decision is to right the course and get back on track, start to balance the family budget before the repo man comes knocking on the door 5-6 years down the road. They don't just go on a vacation to some fancy island in a faraway place and blow even more money and say, well, we're worried about the repo man when he arrives at our home. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. No, they make responsible decisions in the present, modest adjustments to get on track so that they can be financially sustainable into the future. And that is exactly what Canadian households expect of their politicians. They expect that we, like them, live within our means, spend only what we have, and leave more in Canadians' pockets. They know, because they've actually had to make household payments, the basic rules of life, that you cannot borrow your way out of debt, that budgets do not balance themselves, and you can't make other people pay for your mistakes. These are lessons that the Prime Minister would be well to learn. I suspect he won't, but that's okay, because in October, Canadians will have another choice, the son of a working-class family who understands the basic rules of life, that you have to live within your means, leave more in people's pockets, and let them get ahead. Thank you.